What can we learn from people who did transition and telling their story? Well, I'll tell you what. First of all, their stories are very, very important to the whole transgender community. They're important because it's important for us to understand what happens. Did people make a mistake? How did they make a mistake? Was it too difficult to transition? Was there not enough resources? Were other secondary diagnoses at place that made it impossible? Very, very important questions. To negate the fact that people detransition is wrong. To also say that detransitioners are spotlighting community in a bad light is also wrong. Sometimes we just make mistakes. Sometimes you guys just make mistakes. Mistakes happen. And you know what? Gender is one of the most complicated things to understand. So mistakes within the gender realm are going to happen. That's just inevitable truth.
It's hard to say exactly what might have prevented me from transitioning because it wasn't solely the affirmation from doctors and therapists that facilitated it. It was also being part of social justice movements, the narrative that one is born trans, that idea of finding your authentic self. I wasn't permitted, nor would I permit myself, access to information that challenged my thinking. In that sense, I think that people being open about detransition would have prevented me from transitioning. There are two options when you transition. Either you live stealth and you commit the rest of your life to hiding an immutable part of yourself from other people, or you live openly and you commit the rest of your life trying to convince other people to ignore an immutable part of yourself. I would tell my younger self that transition is not the panacea that it's made out to be. I expected it to feel like a rebirth, like I was just beginning the rest of my life. In reality, the change was only external. Everything I had been before I transitioned was still part of me. I still had social anxiety. I was still awkward. I was still depressed. Relationships were still difficult. What changed was I added a burden to my load, and I just managed to convince myself it was unavoidable.
So, next is elitism. The members of the group are the chosen people, exalted, righteous. Members are made to feel special when compared to outsiders. There's this sense of eliteness. What do you think?
I don't know how much that sort of falls under that. I do know that the way that the community, people in the community act is very entitled, but I don't think they necessarily see themselves as elite or entitled. I think they view themselves as oppressed and marginalized and like people who are just trying to secure human rights. So I don't think they don't see themselves as chosen or elite or anything from what I can think of.
Yeah. It's interesting. If you make a study of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, for example, then there's like this difference between the society that they were criticizing and trying to change and the new society. And so they framed all of the landlords and the capitalists who were the elites of the old society as bad. But then all of the people who were the workers or whose parents were in the army or were aligned with the ideology, they were marginalized in the old society, but they were given privilege in the new society and in their own domain. And so it depends on where you zoom in. If you zoom in only on the wider world, then you could say at one point that trans people were marginalized. But if you zoom into the community itself, then we've talked about before how there's a hierarchy of dominance that is determined by your oppression identity markers. And so your voice is given a stronger weight. You're shielded from criticism, and you're given financial privilege when asking for donations based on your oppression markers within that realm. And so I guess there's that element of it where it's hard to say precisely. The second thing is the sense of righteousness. I think anytime you have any of these systems, there's always a moral dimension to it. And if you believe that you're on the right side of history, or that you are following God's commands, or that you have the right political philosophy, then that sense of righteousness infuses everything you do, but it also infuses your sense of identity. You are a good person, and by extension, you're better than people who don't think or believe the way that you do. And then that fuels the actions that you take, and it may lead you to feel justified in doing something against other people because they are ontologically evil. And so you can do anything to them in the service of a higher cause. But all of these things speak to this notion that the people who are in the in-group are somehow better than or more morally justified than everybody else, and it informs all of those decisions.
So that sounds more familiar, especially like the idea of being on the right side of history and like having the moral high ground. There's definitely a strong sense of that.
How effective is that at keeping the group together or keeping people in the group? Did you feel like you were going to lose that sense of goodness if you ever considered leaving the group, or did it play a role?
Maybe a little bit. When I detransitioned, it wasn't like I had lost like my morals or my righteousness at all, but that was something that came up more as my opinions about things were changing.
When
So
you say you didn't lose your morals or your righteousness, how did you define those things at that time when you were detransitioning?
I wanted to see myself as like empathetic and compassionate. And as I was right at the beginning of detransition, there was like a part of me that wanted to, we see this a lot when I'm seeing detrans people online. There's this idea of being like a good detransitioner and a bad detransitioner. And I don't think anyone necessarily calls themselves that, although those of us who are the bad ones might just call us that as just a bit of irony. But the quote unquote good ones are calling themselves trans positive. So they're people who still believe in the ideology, basically. And there's also another contingent of us who wants detransition and being a detransitioner to be defined by having left the ideology. So these people who think that they're the good detransitioners, who are quote unquote trans positive, are basically people who have decided this pathway is not for me, but the ideology is still correct, and everybody who believes in it is still righteous, and etc. I'm not sure how to sort of translate that to a religious cult or anything like that.
Absolutely. There's definitely a way to do that. So there's something called PMO, which is physically in, mentally out. But then there's also a correlate to that, which is where you're mentally in, but physically out. There may be people who have decided they just can't live up to the standards of the group, but they still believe in the truth of the group. So they may either remove themselves from the group or be cast out, but they still believe in the tenets of the group. The group is good and right. They just can't live up to it themselves. And so there's no incentive to, and there's a disincentive for them to really investigate the claims of the group because they're still heavily influenced by and identify with the group. And so they may not really move on in their life or start to develop an identity separate from the group. So that's definitely something that does exist. And those people are then vulnerable to be brought back into the good graces of the group and come back into the group itself. And there's a few stories of people having a season of that in their life that you'll find if you watch various different cult documentaries. So I can definitely see that playing a role in it. When you talked about the good detransitioners and the bad detransitioners, it reminded me of a phenomenon that happens in the ex-Mormon world where people who leave the church but then start talking about the things that they found wrong with the church. They start spreading information that points to the false claims of the leader of the church or the abuses of power that have historically or presently exist in the church. They're the wrong kind of apostates. And so the thing that gets told them is that you left the church, but you can't leave the church alone. You need to move on with your life and silence your criticisms and just only build up what you want to be. Stop trying to be an activist, because all of those people are the wrong types of ex-Mormons. But that's the people in the faith labeling those outside of the faith that. I think there's more of a sense among ex-Mormons that if you want to just leave and get on with your life and not say another peep about it, more power to you. But if you're doing that and then you're criticizing those people who do speak out about it, then they may have something more to say. But you get the freedom to either make it something that's part of your journey after Mormonism or not. I mean, it sounds like there may be some parallels there, particularly with people who remain in or are the good type of detransitioner.
Right. Yeah. It sounds pretty much the exact same. And yeah, the good ones, I don't know if they even count as detransitioners just because the way that everything is defined, it's so incoherent. So there are people who say that they've detransitioned, and what they mean is they stopped taking hormones.
Yeah.
But they still identify as trans and are living an opposite sex role every day of their life. And to me, that is not a detransitioner. If you stopped hormones, then you're just a trans person that stopped hormones. So to me, that it doesn't even make sense. It feels like they're trying to co-opt detransition so that they can say that it's not as bad as the rest of us are saying it is.
It strikes me one of the things that we look for in trying to soften the divide between the insiders and the outsider in the religious realm is having landing zones that are safe, is the metaphor, where people may not be ready for the jump straight from the most radical to complete abandonment of the ideology. That's a harder ask than people who are willing at least to move further away from a radical position into something that is a little bit softer for them on their own journey. That may be a point at which it's easier then to take the next step to completely disentangle themselves from it. And I think we're seeing in the religious realm, a lot of people have found benefit to having that space where they can do that, where it was no longer an all or nothing type of thing, and that it may have been harder for them to go cold turkey. But I don't know if that type of phenomenon exists in the domain that you're talking about.
It sounds a little bit like people have referred to non-binary identities as both like an on-ramp and an off-ramp. And it was for me. So like I identified as a man for 6 years. And then when I went off of testosterone, I identified as non-binary. And I think that is my version of being in between. And
Okay.
sort of it was disengaging from it because I was moving away from medicalization, but not at the same time. But I think there are a lot of people who say they've detransitioned but identify as non-binary. So they're still like 1 foot in, but I do think that is a way of softening it, especially because for a lot of people it's difficult to go from being referred to as like a man and as with he him pronouns, and then for it to switch overnight all the way back to being referred to as a woman and being referred to as she her pronouns. I think there's some psychological barriers that a lot of people have to deal with when they're making that transition and then referring to themselves as non-binary so that they don't have to necessarily commit to either. I think is a good sort of in-between stage for them. So I try not to be too critical of them, but yeah.
All right. So on this question of elitism, there was one other dimension you mentioned earlier on, which is that people who had gone further along the medicalization route tended to have a higher status within the community itself. What do you think? Does that carry its own form of elitism within the group?
I think a little bit, yes. And even as I mentioned myself, I felt like I was more trans than my non-binary friend that had no intention of medicalizing. I don't think most people in the trans community would say that people who have medicalized are seen as better or anything, but you couldn't deny that they seem more committed. For sure. It's irreversible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about
They
that
might-
sense
yeah.
of specialness that they're referring to here? Is there a sense of specialness that I know that critics of the young generation that have accepted and identify with this ideology called them snowflakes? And they're making fun of this idea that every one of them is special and their specialness is somehow tied to their identity and gives them their entitlement. And of course, the older generation is against that. What degree does specialness play?
When I think of that, I think about how most people that identify as trans, they separate themselves from everyone else by this whole idea of you will never understand what I'm going through. And I think that's also a very identitarian thing where, me as a white person will never understand what a black person goes through. And I think that sort of same feeling of like a cis person could never understand what a trans person goes through. I think there is a feeling of specialness that comes with that for sure. So it is definitely. And it's one of the things that keeps people in the group is that understanding that we all understand each other and we know how to treat each other, and the people outside of the group, they don't know how to treat us. Because they're not us, then they will never understand what it's like to be us, and therefore within the group you're safe, but outside of it you're not thing. So yeah, there is a sense of that, I think.
That could also serve to shield you from criticism or questioning, and a shield of doubt in terms of if somebody brings up a counter argument to something, then you just say, you just don't understand, you haven't lived my experience. And so it's a way of shutting down internal doubt. But we'll get to that when we get to the thought terminating cliches.
Yes.
So what do you think? Elitism, how strong a factor is this in your existence in the trans community?
Trans people are sacred. We are the divine. We're practicing our divinity by expressing authenticity, by enjoying our multiplicity, elevating our humanity, finding the unity hidden inside community, remembering our collective connectivity fuels courageous creativity, unlocking the blessed spirituality that we all seek. Yeah, this shit's about to get spiritual. Because the truth is, queerness is magic, like pure magic. I mean, we are beautiful and powerful, and for that we are killed. I mean, the violence is real. We all know how my story ends. But yeah, thank you for letting me grab this beginning moment here with you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for kindness, for giving me courage. I am Joan. This is my story. This is my truth.
It was funny because I started out being like, I'm not sure, but now I think it was intense.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this exercise is just stepping back and seeing how it plays out in religious or political contexts that are removed from your own experience, because then it helps you understand a little bit better if it did show up in your experience. And that's what I'm hoping that this test does for people from many different backgrounds. Okay, dissociative states. Trance induction and dissociative states. Critical thinking skills are reduced through regular encouragement of receptive mental states. Altered states may be mild and seem normal and include concentration, fatigue, boredom, and hunger. So you see this in severe instances in religious groups where they may induce a period of fasting or labor or staying up for long periods of time in a way of breaking down somebody's cognitive and emotional foundations that make them more receptive then to the group. This is something that you'll hear Scientologists talk about happen. Certainly if you see any of the documentaries on Waco or People's Temple, it played a role there. Is there any role or any parallels that you can think of in the trans community?
Not really, except that identifying as trans itself is almost a dissociative state.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that?
It's just, I feel like, I read somewhere, and I've always referred back to this, I read someone say that they think that the two main characteristics of gender dysphoria are dissociation and rumination. So it's being disconnected from your body and feeling like you're not at home in it, and then just obsessing over that idea and obsessing over different parts of your body.
So this is what transgender means. So this is a cis female. Her sex is female, and so is her brain. And this is a cis male. So his sex is male, and so is his brain. But when you're transgender, your brain does not match your body. So like this girl, she's stuck in a male's body, but her brain is female. So using things like hormones and stuff, you would want to transition. And you can also get surgeries as well to make you feel more comfortable in your own skin. So now she's going to transition. So that way her body and her brain match, which will make her happy. There she is, using she, her pronouns. It's sort of like this for a transgender male, except for you will be stuck in a female's body, so your sex will be female, but your gender is male, because your gender is like what's in your brain. So again, you don't want that. There he is, he's sad. So you'd want to transition, so then your body and brain will match. So there he is. Now he, him, and that's the trans flag.
So I've always felt like dissociation was a big part of it, but I don't know if it's necessarily, maybe it is induced to the way that people talk about it. Yeah.
I think you're onto something here. One of the things that first was a red flag for me in terms of drawing the connection between some religious elements of the ideology was watching a documentary on the Heaven's Gate group. It's called like the Cult of Cults. It's on HBO Max, I think. But one of the dimensions, we all remember Heaven's Gate because there was a mass suicide done where there was this like mansion in California that they just found like 39 bodies dressed all the same that were, you heard that they were a little bit androgynous, and you saw they had recorded a video about why they were doing what they did, and all the women had short haircuts and everyone was androgynous. But that didn't make the headlines. The thing that made the headlines was the suicide. So if you watch the documentary, you learn more about what they were teaching and what they identified. And the teachings of the leader included this notion that who they were as an essence was something apart from their physical body, that the physical body was just a vehicle for their essence.
The deepest part of the indoctrination came when they were convinced that they were not human beings. They were convinced that they were actually these beings from the next level above, and that they were essentially living inside these human shells, which they called vehicles.
We'll use the term vehicle when we speak of this body that we're wearing, this flesh and bones, because we don't relate to it. It's not me. It's just a suit of clothes that I wear.
And then there were elements of the physical body that were in conflict with their essence, and that was their sexuality. And the disconnect between who these people were indoctrinated to believe that they were on the road to evolving to a level higher and above human, that their sexuality was in conflict with it.
When you're in a cult, especially for any length of time, you're in what I call a self-sealing system. This is a social system that's closed in on itself. Peer pressure is so important in these groups, right? So you're often comparing yourself to the people who look like they're more devoted so that you can be ridding yourself of all these human characteristics that are in this body that you happen to be living in.
Now, I'm afraid that here I need to get a little personal. Sex is the strongest drug. There's not a drug, there's not a morphine or anything that is produced by chemicals or plants of this world as strong as that drug.
Marshall Applewhite didn't like his homosexuality, so he created a myth around that piece that he didn't like. He came to a conclusion about his body that it was abhorrent.
And so they needed to remove any sexual elements from it, from their appearance. They needed to suppress any sexual feelings or desires that they had. And it went so far as them undergoing voluntary castration.
So he held a meeting and he said that he had a nocturnal emission and he was investigating having himself castrated. Would any of you have reservations of having the same procedure done? And I didn't have any reservations. I was committed to being celibate for the rest of my life.
If your eye offend you, pluck it out. It's the same idea. If something is so offensive to you that your control is threatened by it, then why shouldn't you dispose of it if you have that option to do it?
We set up a sterile room and we're going to proceed doing the castrations. Liv already got the testicle sac open and I almost fainted. So it was done. It's like surreal. That's Rutledge various theorems. Surreal about this. And Jan Odie and I went to the pier and we threw the testicles in there. They found some doctors that would do the procedure. And Doe was also castrated.
Eventually, there were, depending on which source you look to, between 7 and 9 men within the group who had been castrated.
And so when we think of an ideology that can distort and disconnect your sense of self from your physical body and lead you to make drastic decisions such as having your body surgically remove the elements of its sexuality, I think there are a lot of parallels there with what we're hearing trans people having undergone. The most recent standard of care publication of WPATH now includes eunuch as a gender identity for which chemical castration and or surgical castration is considered affirmative care.
First, I'd like to do a little history. Mostly eunuch is the oldest recognized gender outside the binary. It's in the Bible, it's in all kinds of sources. Eunuchs today, though, are mostly an invisible gender. There's no real way to present as eunuch in the Western world. Most present publicly as male. They're indistinguishable from anyone else you see on the street. Sometimes they try to appear androgynous, but there is really no way they demonstrate publicly that they are other than male. And we estimate there are 8,000 to 10,000 self-identified voluntary eunuchs in North America today. And who are these people? Who seeks voluntary castration? One type is men with an extreme gender dysphoria. They desire to be not male, to be emasculated, but don't want to be female either. They have a male to eunuch gender dysphoria, now part of the SOC8. There are others who have a feeling that their genitals are not a part of their proper part of their body integrity dysphoria. This is in the SOC8. It's also in ICD-11. It's classification 621 or 6C21. So it's there in the ICD as well as the standards of care.
Now, you've gone through the surgical phases of that trans journey. Do you see any parallels there, or hearing what I've laid out here, what's your take on it?
And no, it sounded the same, except instead of feeling like sexuality was necessarily problematic and that had to be either suppressed or removed, it was literally biological sex instead. So that's what I was doing throughout my transition, was removing every single part of me that would have given me away as female. So going on testosterone lowered my voice. It changed my fat distribution, which has changed back now. I had the surgeries. I had the mastectomy so that I don't have breasts anymore. I had my uterus cut out. Basically, I removed every single part of me that would have identified me as a female as part of that. And I think that sort of process is really a process of dissociating more and more from your reality until you're just, it is fantasy at the end of it, where you're just sort of, yes, now I'm a man, except you're not really a man. You're just a woman that's removed all of the parts of you that made you, not that made you a woman, because that's something that can't be taken away, but all of the things that would help you be perceived as one. Yeah.
There's one of these questions that come up, which is how far can indoctrination and ideology change your sense of self and bodily integrity? And so can you be brainwashed into thinking that you are the wrong gender, or that there's a disconnect between your true self and your physical body? You can ideologically destabilize someone from a sense of bodily integrity with who they think they are and their comfort within their body by giving them these ideas. Whereas somebody before who may be biologically male but has an affinity for things that are stereotypically female, in the old way of thinking rooted in biological reality, you would just say there's many different ways to be a male, and a more feminine male is still a male, and we as a society should be more embracing and accepting of feminine males. Whereas if you take this new way of thinking, a biological male who has an affinity for things that are stereotypically feminine, well, then we're going to redefine them now as that means that they are a woman. And this has all kinds of implications for what the younger generation who are gay are growing up doing. And this is why people are feeling like there may be eliminating lesbian populations, because the things that would say you were lesbian, and people are being shunted into a trans identity because of how this plays out.
So it used to be very rare for a child to be taken at all seriously if the child said, Mum, I was meant to be a girl, or I feel like I'm really a girl.
but the occasional child who said that it was almost all boys. And one possible reason for that is that being gender non-conforming as a girl is more socially acceptable. We even have a nice word for them, tomboys. We have a much less nice word for boys who are gender non-conforming. They're sissies.
Yeah.
And so sissy boys, inverted commas, I don't use this word myself, were the object of study in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And these were highly gender non-conforming boys who would say to their parents, I was meant to be a girl. I really am a girl. I wish I was a girl. All their friends were girls. They played with girls' toys. They dressed as girls. They would even talk about how they hated their male parts. They wanted them cut off and so on. But when these children were followed into adulthood, it turned out they were nearly all gay. Now, this does not mean that every gender non-conforming little boy is gay.
Sure.
There are lots of little boys who like dressing up and so on, and, they can grow up straight as well. But statistically speaking, there is a link with being gay. Now, that was the historical picture. In the past 10 years, something quite different has happened, which is that teenage girls are by far the largest group who say that they were meant to be or really are members of the opposite sex. Lots of them aren't gay at all. Lots of them really have just spent too much time on Tumblr. It's a place where odd things happen. I have said this a few times. I don't know where I heard it first, but somebody said that social media, in particular Tumblr, is like the island in The Lord of the Flies. It's a place where the children bring each other up with no adults around. And in those places, quite strange and sometimes very distressing things happen. So Tumblr around 2015 was really the high point of girls, teenage girls, really telling each other very odd things about what it would mean to feel like you didn't fit in, to feel like your body was, not the way it was meant to be, to wish and ardently wish that really you were a boy, and maybe even a gay boy if you were a straight girl. To tell those girls that meant that they were really boys, and really to create a social contagion. And this sounds completely odd to adults, but I think only to adults who can't remember being teenagers. It's a strange and intense time, and it's also a time where you're programmed to believe your peers, your age cohort, rather than adults, and to discount what adults say. And also to be quite idealistic, to have quite grand ideas, to think that you can reinvent yourself or that you can change everything. And so those girls are being treated according to a protocol that was developed for a very different group, namely these young boys. Now, I don't think those young boys should have been treated this way anyway, but they were. And that protocol takes as gospel truth the statement, I am really a girl, I am really a boy, and assumes that something inner in that child that's unchangeable, that's been manifested in the statement, I think I'm trans, that's more real and concrete than the body that they were born in. It is incredible. But the thing is, if you believe it, it mandates quite extreme medical interventions. So those interventions, and just to remind everybody, puberty is actually quite a big deal. Yeah. Puberty does quite a lot to our bodies that can't be undone. And in particular, it does a lot to boys. I know it does a lot to us girls as well, but if you take testosterone afterwards as a girl, you can pass as a man much more easily than the other way around. Testosterone is like a one-way street. Your voice breaks and it can never unbreak. Your beard comes in, you can never get rid of it without laser surgery. A lot of things happen, like your jaw widens, your shoulder was widened, your feet and hands get bigger. These are things that are very, very hard to undo. The reason we don't let children get tattoos is we know that most of them may regret it. Like loads of people regret getting tattoos, but if you're over 18, fine. You do what you like. I have none because I knew I'd regret. But yeah, so why you wouldn't let a child get a tattoo, but you'll let them take drugs that are going to lead to permanent changes. Oh, and the other thing I should say about that pathway, this is the hardest thing to say. This shocks me because it is a true medical scandal. If you skip your own puberty entirely, you will never be fertile. You will actually be sterile because we only become fertile during puberty. The ovaries and the testicles just don't mature. You don't produce sperm. Your eggs never can ripen. So if you never go through your own puberty because you blocked it, and then you take cross-sex hormones, you will be sterile, not just infertile, sterile. There is nothing that can help you. Not IVF, not anything. And you will probably be incapable of orgasm as well, because during puberty is when you become fully orgasmic. So what we are doing with children that we put on this pathway, if children start these drugs really at the beginning of puberty, so not even partway through puberty, we are creating sexless, sterile adults. And the reason that we are doing that is because they look better. In the word for somebody, it's a eunuch. We are creating eunuchs, and I can't believe that we're doing that, but we are.
I think you're onto something in that the whole disconnect between your sense of who you are and your gender is a form of dissociation that then facilitates and enables all the other choices in medicalization and surgery is something to really consider. And I hadn't thought of it that way before. All right. So with that being said, how are we going to score it? What score would you give it?
It's probably severe now that we've gone through it, because that's the ideology, really, is that your gender is completely separate from material reality, it just encourages that sort of dissociation.
When you start with that as your foundational assertion, then anything that contradicts that you throw away. And you say, no, this earlier foundational assertion is more important. So if something seems to contradict it, then it's just wrong, and we don't have to pay attention to that.
Pretty much all of the ideology comes down to gender identity exists. And when I detransitioned, my feeling of this was gender identity does not exist. And then if you say gender identity does not exist, or what I would say is gender identity is a concept that's built on pseudoscience, basically, it's all scientific foundations, then nothing else in the ideology makes any sense. And it's really just the one pillar that's holding it up.
Wow. The problem with you saying that is you're using words that have a general definition or a general understanding that I think is probably not specifically what you're talking about. So if you say gender identity exists, then a normie would say, I think I'm a guy, that's my identity, so yeah, my gender identity exists. But there are a bunch of assumptions that go along with that, according to the ideology.
When I'm saying that it's a pseudoscientific thing, I'm saying all of the science around it, all of the studies around it are based on an idea that they're just assuming is true. They're just they're assuming that trans is a thing. They're assuming that gender identity is a thing, and everything that they're doing is basically set up on that sort of foundation. But if you dig deep into it, there isn't a lot of evidence that it is an innate thing. So, yeah.
Speaking about how research interfaces with this, I think the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria and how that played out with a clinician who was trying to understand this phenomenon is a big warning sign, just in terms of how we can rely on research anyway. If there are strong, intense, potentially career-ending negative consequences for reporting on results that don't match the activism narrative, then it's going to be hard to trust science, because then we can't trust that any negative things could be reported on if they happen. Therefore, any positive things you can't really trust. And it makes it harder for physicians then to act in the way that they would act with any other form of disease or discomfort that they try to address in patients' lives.
Yeah. It's very concerning, to be honest.
Okay, so dissociative states, let's go ahead and give it a score and see what we have next.
I think I said severe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, guilt and shame. A cycle of guilt and shame comes from repressed doubts, social pressure, and failure to meet impossible standards.
Yeah, that's pretty much constant. But
in what way?
First, there's always a feeling that, especially if you're actually in activism, there's always a feeling that you're not doing enough. There's that feeling of guilt in social justice, especially because they're identitarian. I think a lot of people feel guilt over their own privilege, for example, or what they are told is their privilege. So that's one part of that. But I saw the words repressed doubts, which obviously are a really big thing in the trans community. And so there's a lot of people who are doubting it. It's really easy to find doubts on any subreddit, any forum. There's people who are talking about it all the time. And almost all of them are told that it's not that you're not trans, it's internalized transphobia. So that's how doubts get reframed, is that it's your mind being oppressive to yourself, basically. You're being transphobic to yourself. You're saying that trans has to be one way. You're preventing yourself from expressing yourself authentically. You're afraid because trans people aren't accepted in society. If you have the thought at any point in time, what if I'm not trans? What if I'm just making this all up in my head? And I did have that thought. And the way that I got through that was just pushing that aside. So yeah, that would be another, maybe not guilt. Maybe it's not even really guilt or shame, but it is a way of removing the possibility of having guilt later on if you detransitioned, I guess. So related in that way.
In defining these things a little bit better, guilt would be feeling bad about yourself for not conforming to the beliefs or actions expected of you. And shame would be the feeling of badness that you get from the judgments of others when they see that you have not conformed. And so what you're talking about, and just in terms of if you start to question any of the dogma, then you're already given the way you're supposed to respond to those internal doubts, which could be a source of guilt, which is to silence them, to squash them, to reframe them as self-hatred. And so then you can continue in that mode of belief. What about public shaming? People will say that cancel culture itself is a form of shaming that's meant to police thought and police speech. And that seems to be a very strong component of the trans activist community in particular. Would you agree with that? And how would you explain this?
Yeah, that is a big part of it, is basically the possibility of being canceled, which is a public shaming. So that does make shame a really big part of it. And really, there's a lot of secondhand shame seeing other people being canceled as well. So, yeah.
Is that form of social policing reserved for outsiders, or would you find that it's applied equally no matter where you are, and the thing that reigns supreme is really just the right thoughts and the right language has to be used whether you're inside or outside?
I think anyone, and it's not necessarily the people inside that have to be doing it. And it's become very strange in a lot of these identitarian type spaces because, and a lot of people have pointed this out recently, especially, is that a lot of the people that are proselytizing now on behalf of trans people are not trans themselves. So it's a lot of people who just think that they're doing the right thing, so they're going to jump in and they're going to do the punishing on behalf of the marginalized group that shouldn't have to do it, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with that. It's odd because there's a way to push back against that, which in the race domain, people will say we don't need white saviors. And doing that implies that there's something weak or incompetent about the group that you're defending, that you think you need to come in and save them. Does that exist also in the domain of gender?
They can't really make up their mind with that. On one part, it's cis people, you need to step up and protect your trans siblings. And then on the other hand, basically it's you need to center trans voices and you need to uplift trans voices. And why are you trying to take the wheel from us, kind of thing. So it is like a little bit of both, where it's you need to be doing more, but you're not doing enough. You're not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So
no, we're going to cover the double bind, which that sounds like a good example of in the future. But the other thing is it's really useful because it allows you to criticize or problematize somebody if it serves the greater good, no matter what they do. And the fact that's happening in social media means that you're using public shame as a way to compel compliance, which very much fits into what we're assessing right here. So you mentioned that it does play a role in repressing doubts, social pressure, that guilt and shame, and realizing that it can be taken on and acted on by people who aren't even in the community, I think is part of the reason that we're silencing dissent and not seeing people like that. You would have nobody give a like to posts about your own experience as a detransitioner, is the fear of the consequences that go along with having wrongthink, and the shame involved with the community judgment and actions based on that is pretty powerful.
Yeah. I think
so. What do you think? How do you score it?
I think it's severe, to be honest.
All right. Okay, you've mentioned this one before, and so I'm interested in your take on it. Love bombing. Friendliness, flattery, praise, and affection are used to entice participation and attendance for potential recruits and retain members who might be showing less enthusiasm or thinking of leaving. Members must project an image of happiness for the sake of the group.
Yeah. So a lot of people get that right when they come out. There's a lot of celebration of the trans identity. And I think it also gets reinforced with every single step you take. And I think that's why I didn't mention this earlier, but I've said several times now that there is that sort of expected pathway that people are taking. And I think that's how that it's expected, because as soon as they announce, oh, I'm going to go on hormones, then again, there's another celebration. I'm going to have top surgery. There's another celebration. Each time there's a lot of you're just getting the positive feedback over and over. So they might say there's no one way to be trans, but if there's only one way in which you're getting positive feedback every single step of the way, that's how it's happening. Yeah.
And if, by contrast, if you were to come out and then say, I've decided that hormones and surgery are not for me and I'm happy with who I am as a trans person without those things, would there be the same level of celebration?
I'm not sure. I think they're like within, if you said that on Facebook or something, I'm sure like all of the people that were friends with them and family with them would be totally down with it. They'd be totally fine with it. It would be something that they might even celebrate as like you're taking your own path sort of thing. But I feel like it wouldn't be as widespread like amongst the community.
You've mentioned that there are factions that exist. What is a trans medicalist and how would they receive something like that?
Yeah, transmedicalism is people who believe that trans it's a medical condition, essentially. And I do feel like they're closer to the truth. So they do believe it's a medical condition. And if you have the medical condition, then you're supposed to get the treatment for it. They don't necessarily think that you have to medically transition, but they don't believe transgender is simply a gender identity that differs from your sex. They believe transgender is something they were born with. It's a medical condition that they were born with and that needs treatment. And the mainstream feeling of trans lately is a lot more concentrating on expression and like personal truth rather than really like evidence-based medicine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so on love bombing, then we talked about the vulnerabilities that exist in particularly the groups that tend to be moving in this direction. Young women in particular, there seems to be a strong uptick in young women who are identifying as trans and pursuing medical or surgical intervention. And people have tried to draw parallels between other things that have a social contagion element, if they want to look at it through that lens, such as cutting or anorexia, and just say there's something about the development of young women at that particular stage that make them particularly vulnerable to this. But with that vulnerability of all of the issues that go along there, there's this thing that can provide a great deal of euphoria and sense of acceptance, which is this love bombing, where people are just giving you so much positive affirmation that may feed your ego. It may give you a different narrative than the idea that you're an outsider and no one understands you, because now you have this whole community of people that understand you. Did love bombing play a big role in your own journey?
I am not sure if it really did for me personally. And maybe it was because I transitioned before it was, I don't want to say the cool thing, but it was before it became the social contagion that it became in 2014-ish. I transitioned in 2010. So I was a few years early, but it was very big on Tumblr at that time as well. And I don't really know, I can't think of any instances where it was really, love bombing was really a thing. In fact, I got more love bombed when I detransitioned, which people will point that out. They'll be like, oh, detransitioners are getting love bombed by the gender critical movement. And yes, they are. Assessments like this, is it culty? That's how we figure out whether it's a good love bombing or a bad love bombing. And I don't think it's necessarily from the gender critical side. It's not necessarily always good, but I think people just need to keep in mind that not everybody is interested in them as a person. Sometimes they're just interested in your story. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a thing that I received too much of. Although I do think I got more positive feedback on my selfies when I was still trans, even though I think I look better now. But yeah.
The point that you bring up in terms of how do you distinguish love bombing from authentic connection and authentic positive feedback, which everybody justifiably may experience in their life and find positive results from. And that point that you made in terms of people being interested in you as a person versus you as simply an avatar for your identity or your place in an ideology is a really important distinguishing factor between the two. I was on a podcast recently where we were discussing this issue of love bombing, and that's the critical distinction. If people are seeing you for who you are and accepting of your differences from them in terms of the way that you think about things or your answer to the questions of society, then that's more of an authentic connection and what could be the start of a real friendship versus something that is contingent upon you believing the same things, participating in the community. And as soon as you show any deviation from that, then they're going to withdraw that positive affirmation. Then that becomes a red flag that this may be love bombing that's more ideologically driven rather than an authentic positive connection with another human being. People will talk about at times when they are starting to express doubts first. That may be a moment where the group starts to shower them with additional praise to try to entice them to squelch their doubts and remain among the faithful in religious contexts. Does that exist, or did you observe anything like that? Is it a secondary love bombing sort of thing?
I can't think of very many examples, but what it does remind me of is after detransitioning, sometimes I will, and I've seen other detransitioners as well, encounter people who are trying to bring us back in very clearly. They'll say, and in fact, they will use the fact that the people that we associate with now might only care about our stories and not really care about us. So they'll say things like, oh, these TERFs don't actually care about you. They only want to weaponize your narrative, and then suggest that we left the beautiful utopia where we would always be loved, and then we are still loved. We just need to come back into the fold, sort of thing. So that does exist. I don't know if it's necessarily love bombing, but that does happen. Yeah.
It definitely sounds like it's in the category. What about the sense that whatever you're feeling, you need to project that your participation in the group is the best thing ever, and that you have a happy life, your problems have been positively addressed by your participation in the group. And it's like this facade of fake positivity that you have to project in order to maintain the illusion that the group is positive and healthy and good for people. Did that play a role in your participation?
I think so, yeah. I think I said earlier that I would have said it was life-saving and that I needed to do it and etc., which isn't really, I don't think is true. What that reminds me of, though, is that like I've mentioned I was in a really controlling relationship, and I felt obligated to do things like that, where I would basically talk about how awesome my relationship was or how awesome my partner was, even though we were having trouble behind the scenes. And it was a way of it's really cognitive dissonance, trying to soothe it, just knowing that I thought it was bad. But if I just keep telling people that it was good, then maybe I was going to start to believe it, sort of thing. But yeah, no, I did do that throughout my transition, where in looking back at it now, I can see that it didn't help me in probably any way at all. Like the only way you could say it quote unquote helped me was that it taught me what the wrong thing to do was. But yeah.
I think knowing that's how you see it and reflect on it in your life, it's got to be difficult to have people then accusing you of finding positivity in the people who are willing to show you that positivity, choosing a different path, as just you falling for some other brainwashing scheme or scam is difficult.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that people realize in the religious context or the political context is all the flattery and all the praise is really just for doing the things that are expected of the group. And it's all fake. And so one of the things that manifests the love bombing is that when you do decide to go your own way, suddenly all those friends that you had, all the positive affirmation that you had, disappears in a puff of smoke. Whereas if you have a friend who's in like a knitting club and then they move to the crochet club, actually, I shouldn't use that example. I hear that those people are very wed to their particular hobby, but something like that, where it's like some non-controversial thing, like you would still show up for your friends, still support them in their achievements that they see as positive from their perspective. But that degree of fakeness to the flattery and praise is an element of why it's considered love bombing and not real. Did you find your friends disappear or their positive influence disappear?
Yeah, no, I did. Some of them unfriended me immediately. Not very many. I think only a few. And then the rest, there were a couple people I had actual confrontations with, specifically when I started criticizing the medicalization aspect, because that really is my biggest criticism. And then there were a few people that I'm still technically friends with, in that we're still connected on social media, but we almost never interact with each other. So it does feel like a lot of that went away. And as I said before, I post things about detransition where literally no one likes it, no one comments, no one says anything. So yeah, no, it did go away.
Okay, well, on this metric of love bombing, how would you rate your experience?
For me, moderate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is related to stuff we talked about in the past. Social pressure. Social acceptance and rejections are used as a reward and punishment. A member becomes driven with a desire to conform.
Yeah, it's pretty severe.
Yeah, I think this falls under some of the category when we talked about guilt and shame. A lot of that is mediated by social pressure.
Yeah.
You took some steps that are a level beyond in terms of surgery and medication than what many people will have taken on that journey. Did social pressure play a role in deciding to take those steps? And how strong was that in the decision?
I think it did. I'm trying to think about why I chose each of my surgeries. And every time I think about the only reasons that I had, they seem such like inadequate reasons for having surgery. Like, for example, one of the big driving factors behind the mastectomy was that I wanted to be able to swim with my shirt off. And just thinking back on that now, just how it just seems like a very small thing to have such a big surgery over. It was a young person, it was a youth's decision, basically. I was 23 when I made the decision. It's a childish decision in hindsight.
If we drill down on that particular point, just to understand how an idea like that might become a larger than life idea in the mind of a young person, where would you have first encountered the idea that that was an important thing that might be a part of the calculation to get surgery?
I think part of it was that I went to a summer, I guess it was a camp. Yeah, it was like a summer camp thing with other people. And that is how like the pressure came into it. The social pressure was that I was around all of these mostly men, mostly guys, young guys that all had their shirts off. And there was me who had to wear a t-shirt in the water. So I think that's sort of where it came from, was that it was, again, that desire to be like everyone else and to belong and to not have to stand out. That's another sort of contradiction that I experienced throughout transitioning, was that there was this simultaneously I wanted to fit in and belong and be like everyone else, and at the exact same time knowing that if I was transitioning, I was always going to be different, and the reason I was transitioning is because I was already different and I had never fit in anywhere in my life. And then later on down the road, when I started dyeing my hair, I think that was another sort of thing where I was like, I'm different from everyone and I'm okay with that. And yeah, so it was a little bit of both. But yeah, I don't know.
All right.
Yeah.
Social pressure then. How do we want to score it?
See, it's high, the social pressure. All of those other aspects that talk about social pressure, I think it's severe.
Okay, this is interesting. So, induced phobias. Fears are instilled, which are either imaginary, based on real or exaggerated consequences, or on artificial effects created from group pressures. So in a religious context, you may have fear of hell or of damnation, or you may have exaggerated consequences. If you leave us or if you start having a beer on Friday nights, then you're going to turn into a raging alcoholic and you're going to destroy your life. All these things are overblown or created fears that are designed to keep people within the group and believing and acting according to group dictates. How much of a role did this play?
It's a big role. So they basically, the idea that everyone in society who isn't trans is transphobic creates this sort of feeling where you're scared of literally everybody who's not trans. And they keep that going by really emphasizing everything that goes wrong for trans people. So they have Trans Day of Remembrance, where people are getting together and remembering all of the trans people that have been either murdered or committed suicide that year. And they'll just read down the list of all of these names. And there's a website that sort of goes through each of their stories. So there's that day where we're remembering how horrible everybody is to trans people. And in the wake of that, especially in like the last few years when there's been more legal challenges to medicalization and everything, on social media, there's a lot of people, a lot of activists now that are claiming that we're at the beginning of a trans genocide. And they believe that basically the government is going to come, pull them from their houses, force them to detransition, take them off of medicine, basically everything like that. So that's where we're at right now, is this constant level of fear that something is going to be taken away from you, that you're going to be forced to do something that you don't want to do. Yeah, no, it's pretty constant.
I wasn't expecting that perspective on it. I think as an outsider, a lot of what you hear in phobia induction in terms of if you don't allow your child who's questioning their gender to transition, then they're going to commit suicide. So it creates this fear based on that, but that's a total different realm. What you're talking about seems a lot more akin to if you listen to something like the sermons of David Koresh. When all that happened, there was this fear about the government constantly trying to infringe upon the rights. You can listen to other far right political activists that talk about government planning to turn to communism, or far left people talking about the government turning to fascism, and that constant fear about these shadowy forces drives people's need to continue to be on the good side and be a part of the thing. The element of trans suicides, how is that used, if it is for fear within the group itself?
Why do parents go along with this? Many simply do not know that without affirmation, most gender dysphoric children will desist. The suppression of high-quality research and the reification of identities within left-wing politics mean they think they are doing the right thing. Any doubts are quelled by an oft-repeated claim that gender dysphoric children face a choice of transition or suicide. When you have the top clinicians saying that if you don't take the affirmative approach, you're going to kill your kid, says Denise, the founder of Fourth Wave Now. Well, it's the worst thing that could happen. And to think that you could be responsible for it. Horrifying statistics are thrown around without context. Once you search for sources, they fall apart. Take, for example, an endlessly repeated figure of 48% for the share of young trans people who have attempted suicide. It turns out to be based on the responses of 27 British trans people in a larger survey promoted on LGBT websites. Not only is the number of respondents tiny, but there is no reason to think they are typical. If you want to find out something about a whole population, you must construct a representative sample. In an article in 2017 for Fourth Wave Now's website, Ray Blanchard and Michael Bailey debunked the transition or death narrative. Although suicide is somewhat more common among gender dysphoric people than the general population, they write, it is still very rare. And that elevated risk can be explained by gender dysphoria co-occurring with other mental health conditions such as eating disorders and depression. There is no evidence that these are caused by dysphoria, or that transitioning will resolve them and make suicide less likely. Scrolling through posts in a closed Facebook group for parents taking the gender affirmative approach with their children, the importance of the transition or death narrative is clear to see. If a newcomer expresses doubts, old hands immediately intervene to say that they must affirm their child's gender to stop them killing themselves.
I think that's also another pressure that pushes people towards medicalization, is that that repeated idea that transition is life-saving. And that is definitely something that made me move forward, is that idea that if I don't transition, then I'm never going to live my life the way that I was meant to live my life. And I was already had suicidal ideation before I transitioned. So there was that feeling that, oh, maybe that this is what's causing it. But yeah, no, that is also a really big part of it, is not even just the constant feeling that other people are going to hurt you, but also that constant feeling that if you don't get what you want, you might hurt yourself. Yeah.
Is there any other dimension where you saw fear play out in how the community ordered the proper ways of thinking and acting?
There was also the public shaming. So there's that constant low-level fear that you're going to be the next. You're going to be next. Particularly if you do the wrong thing, if you say the wrong thing, then you might be the next person that they end up publicly shaming. So that is one of the ways that fear is used to control. And maybe this is true for a lot of cults, but I don't think that they even consciously realize that they're doing that. Maybe not even just cults, but just like in regular relationships, I don't think people realize that they're controlling with fear. I think they see it from a different angle. They see that it's a way of doing justice rather than a way of manipulating people.
Yeah. And it may be one of those things that just plays on some evolutionary reality that our brains operate that way. There's these videos where the person is trying to get a dog to take a pill, and so they try to force a puppet dog to take the pill, and the puppet dog refuses, and so they beat the puppet dog's head while the other dog is watching, and then they go and they try to give it to the dog, and the dog takes it right away because they've learned what happens to the other one.
Sit! Sit! Good boy. Good boy. Axel, come here.
I think there's another video where the same thing's happening for a kid, and they're pretending to give the medicine to a dolly, and the doll doesn't, and so they smack the dolly, and then the kid takes the medicine right away because they don't want to get smacked like they just saw.
Yeah.
What's she doing?
No.
Uh-oh.
No. No.
So we understand negative consequences for behavior, and that does have an influence on the choices that we make, and that can play out in social media just like it could play out in a laboratory setting.
Yeah.
All right, so that's some interesting factors to think about regarding how induced phobias may play out in that realm. How do you want to rate it?
I'd say intense.
Okay. Blame reversal. The leadership, the group, and doctrines are above reproach. So any failed promises, bad situations are always the fault of the member. Did you encounter this?
Oh yeah. This is basically the entirety of detransitioning. So as soon as you detransition, everything was your fault the whole time. Basically, I get this from weirdly both sides of the political spectrum. So I'll get like people who are on the right wing who, in general, they value personal responsibility and taking responsibility for your own actions. And it's been very weird to get it from people on the far left because they're usually not very personal responsibility type people. They're the type of people who go, it's just institutions and systems, they're all responsible for what you eventually end up doing. So for example, systematic transphobia made you do this or made you do that or whatever. And so they'll take it off of the person unless you detransition, because then when you detransition, everything's your fault. It's a very weird thing to experience, to be in spaces where people are constantly blaming systematic problems for everything that's going wrong in their life. But then as soon as you say something like, I think that the medical system there's a systematic problem here and I've been harmed by it. And then they'll just say, oh, you just don't want to take personal responsibility. It's a very weird flip.
And do they start dissecting your journey from beginning to end, saying that it was all of your fault? Because I see parallels here with the religion in terms of if you leave a religion that is one of these high demand religions, they'll start to say you didn't pray hard enough, you didn't live righteously enough, you gave space to the voice of Satan rather than holding on to the light. There's all different ways of articulating the blame reversal, but it's definitely there. And they'll go back from the beginning. How deep is it when they lay this at your feet?
Yeah, and this isn't always trans people. This is just a lot of the people that have spoken to me, but I've had people tell me that transition didn't work for me because I didn't have bottom surgery. So like the suggestion there was I should have gone further, which I think is crazy. I've had people tell me that it didn't work for me because people have called me a quitter. Basically, like, I don't know, I wasn't committed enough. When I try and talk about the medical aspect of it, like what the doctors did wrong, they'll just say that, oh, the doctors were doing what they were told to do. That's the standards of care. It's this way because if it wasn't, then all of these other people would be harmed by it. But literally everything is to remove any blame from either the trans community itself, which I put so much blame on because of all of the different social pressures, all of the, if you think you're trans, you are, things like that website, amitransgender.net. They're literally putting the idea into your head constantly. They're telling you that all of your doubts are internalized transphobia. They're telling you to lie to your doctors, et cetera, et cetera. They'll say all of these things. And then at the end of the day, when you look back on it and go, oh, that was a bad thing. They shouldn't have done that. You guys shouldn't have done that either. Everything is to take all of the blame away from that. So transition can never be a bad thing. It's always good. And if it is bad, then it's a buyer's remorse. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got out of my haircut because my hair was driving me nuts. And I shaved it because I'm tired of watching my hair thin out. And it's less distressing if I shave it. So when I talk about being too far gone, I don't really know what else to call it. This is what I mean. This is how deep my voice is. It's gotten deeper over time and it's settled. This is what I mean by hair loss. And it just keeps getting worse. It keeps thinning. It keeps receding backwards. And I'm not exactly sure that's coming back. Those are the main things when I talk about being androgenized, to a point of no return. That's why, just because I don't really see me personally being able to come back from what's happened so far. So I hope that's a little explanatory. Just to kind of give more awareness to the situation. There you go. This is what happens when you give a woman testosterone. This for 5 years. This is what happens, essentially. So, that's it. Stay safe. And I would be fine living as a male, but at the same time, if I could go back, I absolutely wouldn't have done this. I would just be like a kick-ass butch lesbian and live my life. My heart breaks for these people. And, you hear the side effects of Lupron and, the long-term implications of unregulated testosterone or estrogen use where it's not observed. It just there's a lot more. Have I been hurt by the system? Yes, I have. But there's a lot more people that a lot worse things are happening to. And their case is a lot more common than mine is, at least that we know at this point. And that's kind of why I am saying something.
One detransitioner who's whining about testosterone making them go bald is the funniest shit ever. And it kind of proves how all these detransitioners who whine about how trans healthcare needs to be restricted because they made a mistake. It just proves how whiny and stupid they are and how immature they are because they can't take responsibility for their own actions and own mistakes. That's on you if you fucked up. It's not on us. You stupid idiot.
First of all, I'm gonna post a picture of this baboon real quick. Okay, you see it? We all see it, right? Okay. He gets into saying that he lost his hair before due to PCOS and the hormones contributing to it. I'm gonna start with number one, saying do your research before you go and start HRT.
That detransition guy is so fucking stupid because it's did you think testosterone was gonna make you into Justin Timberlake? If you were 4'11" before you started, it's not gonna add some extra inches, buddy. Oh, take it back now that I'm ugly.
Not exactly sure that's coming back.
Yeah, so transitioning isn't going to make you into Harry Styles or Lola Bunny, and I'm so sick of seeing specifically white trans masks. become so distraught and befuddled when they get secondary sex characteristics like male pattern baldness, or when they get things that aren't just pretty twinky little aesthetics. This is what happens when you make decisions and don't think about the consequences of your actions. Transitioning isn't the key to a happily ever after. Transitioning, typically, unless you turn into a balding white dude like you, makes your life fucking harder. I really do empathize with anyone going through gender dysphoria and who didn't quite make the right decision and has a hard time going backwards. But if you're going to then be a vindictive little gremlin and jeopardize all these trans people.
This video is for a specific subgroup of detransitioners that have been piping up lately, usually white former trans masks who are falling into TERF ideologies because they fucked up not listening to their doctors prior to the transition process and are now regretful. That's what happened. That's what fucking happened. The fact that you fucked up and did not listen and refused to take accountability for that is not our fault. And I don't know why you're trying to make it harder for us to exist because you fucked up. It's not my fault you made a mistake.
You know, like, why am I this beautiful fucking anime boy? Stop weaponizing detransitioning and trying to make it harder for us when you've personally went through it and you know how we feel. Fucking idiots.
And you can think of all these different things that you list. You can see them being applied to other people, and that kind of it does that fear thing where you see other people going down that route and you don't want to go down that route because you don't want to be subject to that. When we see this happen in a religious or a political context, we could very easily say, yeah, all of those negative consequences and blame reversal are creating a pressure for people to continue along a pathway and to not dissent, to not doubt, to not remove themselves from that situation because it's a manipulative situation where they're demonizing and blaming reversal. But then when you try to see that phenomenon happen in the group itself, it's harder to come to that realization about the group that you're in yourself. But what you're describing has so many parallels with people leaving other religious paradigms and being blamed for not being committed enough or not being pure enough.
And I did this too. I had a friend that I lived with that detransitioned 6 months before me. And that's basically what I was doing to him in those 6 months, was basically telling him all the things that I'm being told now. Not necessarily like that he wasn't committed enough or anything, but more that he needed to take responsibility for it, or there was nothing that anyone could have done. That's the sort of idea that we're given, is that everything that happened, it happened because the way that we're doing everything now is perfect and nothing needs to be changed, etc. So then when detransitioners are coming out saying, actually, we do think things need to be changed and this is how they need to be changed, then we get silenced by people saying other things, basically, just to, I don't know what it is. This, for whatever reason, this one medical treatment can't ever be wrong. It can't ever be a bad thing. It can't ever be given out in the wrong way.
And it seems like much along the religious parallels, well, it's not just that it can't be wrong, but like it can't even be partially criticized. Like even if you're trying to say we need to change some things, well, that even that level of doubt is wrong. And it seems like from what you're relating that the bigger picture is that all of the ideas, the ideology that fuels how those medicalized treatments are implemented, that itself also is beyond reproach. Like you can't question or doubt that. You can't even, to go from the foundational assertion that justifies everything else is the notion that there's this gender identity that exists as some real thing, and then for you to question that and just say no, that even that assertion is wrong, that blows apart everything else from an ideological perspective. I don't know how you could get to that except for gradually moving that way as the process of unpacking and detangling yourself from this web of ideas and assumptions takes place. So it sounds like you were affected pretty significantly by blame reversal. Would you also say that is going to be true of almost anyone who's taken steps that then they want to now go back on and say, it didn't work out for me. The promises that I would have fewer bouts of depression, that I'd feel better about myself, that I'd integrate better into society, all these different things. When they come out with these criticisms, they're going to be told, no, the problem is you did it wrong or you're to blame, rather than the promises or the ideas. Is that going to be unique to you, or do you think it's widespread?
I think it's every single person that is going to say anything. I can see the words failed promises, like that is what transition was. It was a failed promise, and they don't want to admit that there was a promise to begin with. Basically, they're trying to reframe it so that it was entirely neutral. You made the choice on your own, sort of thing. But yeah, any person that detransitions, or even there are trans people that just regret transitioning and just stay transitioned. Anyone who says anything bad about transition or about the trans community, they're going to be told that actually it was your fault the whole time, or some degree of that. So yeah, no, I think it's very much widespread.
All right. So rating then?
Severe.
Okay, Euphoria Induction. The euphoria of group participation and fulfilling the members' ideals motivates good behavior and reduces doubt while proving the validity of the group.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily like the euphoria of group participation or like filling the ideals, but there is that concept of gender euphoria, which I think probably fits. And I think it is actually fulfilling the ideals. So like when your expression is exactly the way that you want it to be, or when other people perceive you the way that you want them to, whether it's in a binary fashion or they're just confused by you and you're happy about that. I think that's the type of euphoria that really does connect people to it.
So this is a term that some people may be unfamiliar with. When you say gender euphoria, you're talking about a kind of sense of goodness that overwhelms you when your gender expression in the context of the ideology gets accepted by outsiders, so that you feel like you're accepted and you can participate and all your dreams in that regard are fulfilled? How would you describe it?
Yeah. Say that I was wearing something that I felt good in one day, and I identified as a man at that time. Someone at the shops call me sir or something like that. I might experience like a really good, happy feeling about that, and I might call that gender euphoria.
Okay.
There's other sort of versions of it, and for example, I know in some forums there'll be men talking about how they put on clothes or put on makeup and then they feel euphoric, but they're also aroused at the same time. They have a word for it, euphoria boner.
You know what's interesting is that even though I do so much beauty content, one of the things you rarely see is the application process of makeup. It is, I commodify everything in my life. I mean, I do. It's just what I do for a living. The makeup time is a time where like I have the music and I experience the gender euphoria. I think that is something that I keep very private to myself. And it's something that is very special, very unique. It's an exploratory part. It's very sacred to me, that time.
So sometimes euphoria means other things as well.
So that may be in the autogynephilia population, where there is an arousal dimension to the notion of themselves as the opposite gender that plays some role in their identity as a trans individual.
Yeah, they wouldn't call themselves AGP. The sort of belief within the trans community is that autogynephilia is a pseudoscience and doesn't actually exist. So most of the people that identify with that, they're separate from the trans community in the way that we're talking about it. But there's a lot of behavior that looks exactly like it, exactly like how you would describe autogynephilia. And there's a lot of people explaining it away by using terms like, oh, you were just aroused because you're really happy to be expressing your gender the right way.
I see. It seems like when this shows up, that experience of euphoria, there's something about tying it to the validity of the teachings of the group that makes it especially meaningful and especially important in binding you to the group. Because somebody may have the feeling of feeling good or presenting as the way they want to, or passing, that gives them a positive feeling. But if it's tied to, that means that our group teaching and your identity within the group are right, then it kind of adds that cultiness to it. where it's not just you feeling good, it's you feeling good because of your adherence to our teachings and ideology.
It is a feeling of rightness. Yes. It's very much, and to be contrasted with gender dysphoria, which is a feeling of wrongness. Yeah.
So how strong would you say this played a role?
Probably intense.
Okay. All right, so next is no honorable exit. In the minds of leaders and members, there are no honorable or valid reasons to leave the organization.
Yeah.
Those who leave are denigrated or demonized.
Yeah.
And we're talking to one right now.
Yeah.
If you have detransitioned, do not speak on the trans experience. I'm going to say it again. Do not speak on the trans experience. You aren't trans if you detransition. You never were trans. You had an identity confusion that you needed to express somehow, and detransitioning isn't wrong. Okay, you found yourself good, but don't speak on the goddamn trans experience. When when HRT is life-saving, and these surgeries are life-saving even for minors, you have no right to go and bash on them and say it's wrong and they shouldn't be doing that. Because while it made you feel shitty about yourself, it saved my life and thousands of people's lives, just like me.
So I don't know if it's necessarily like 100% matchy, because there are those quote unquote good detransitioners, but you could argue that those ones that are good never actually left because they're still committed to the ideology.
No, I think that's the distinction here, is that if you're still committed to the ideology, you still participate with the activism and in the community, you haven't really left. Maybe you've made different choices in the level of your commitment, but you haven't left.
Right, yeah. So there are what they would say are valid reasons to detransition and to stop medicalizing. But I don't think that they would believe that there's any such thing as like an honorable reason to become gender critical, for example, or to stop believing in gender identity.
So I guess you brought up the term gender critical, and I think that's the first time it's shown up here, although it's been alluded to. I've tried to draw a distinction. We use the word ideology a lot, and I try to define that as a connected collection of beliefs about the way that the world works. And an ideology can be built on dogma, and we'll define dogma as statements or assertions that cannot be questioned. And so when we describe gender ideology, people may respond by saying, well, everyone has an ideology. Well, if it's a gender ideology and it's composed by a lot of dogma, a lot of things that cannot be questioned or proven true, then that may be different from a different ideology, which is not so dogmatic in that that you're free to question or to challenge assumptions and thereby get closer to truth as measured by some sort of a rational way of measuring it. Is gender critical another ideology? What is gender critical?
And I think it depends on the person you ask. It might mean different things to other people, because I've read articles or blog posts where people are talking about being gender critical, and they're saying that it's not just disagreeing with gender ideology, it's also being critical of femininity and masculinity as a whole, and wanting to do away with that, maybe wanting to abolish it. I'm saying gender critical just as like a shorthand for people critical of the concept of gender identity. So I'd prefer to say I'm critical of gender identity rather than gender critical, but it flows better. So
no, I get you. You know, we have this phenomenon where people will say I'm ex-Mormon, and that's not very descriptive. It just tells you where you've been from. But there are ex-Mormons who are Christians. There are ex-Mormons who are atheists. There's a bunch of different ways to be ex-Mormon. And so it's hard to pigeonhole all of them in it. But by using the word ex-Mormon, you're positioning yourself in distinct contrast to Mormonism. And so then people will say you've created a negative identity for yourself that is just another identity. And if you want to really move on, you need to abandon all of those labels and just move on and be yourself. And there may be some truth psychologically to that in the big picture, but for now, it helps at least people with shared experiences communicate with each other and find each other. Is there a term other than detransitioner that you feel like matches that? Because it sounds like detransitioner doesn't necessarily mean that you've left the ideology behind.
Yeah, we want it to mean that. When I say we, I just mean the other detransitioners that want that. So the people who have left the ideology want detransitioner to mean specifically that they've left the ideology. One of the reasons that we don't call ourselves ex-trans is because we didn't want it to be conflated with ex-gay.
Oh, okay.
So we didn't want people to be making parallels with the ex-gay movement as well.
Yeah.
It's different, but I feel like that's what it should mean. It should be synonymous with ex-transgender, and I guess that's where we are with the divide between detransitioners who say they're still trans. So
yeah, and it seems like another complication with that is that there are trans individuals who don't root their transness in queer theory to the extent that the trans movement predominantly does today. Queer theory being that it includes all of this postmodern linguistic construction, decoupling sex from gender and seeing everything as arbitrarily socially constructed, and so it can be deconstructed and reformed any way you want. And that gives the extreme form of liberation that we've talked about already in this. Was there are trans people who say, no, I don't buy into any of that ideology about it, but I do, even though I understand that I'm a man, I just choose to live as a woman in society. But that doesn't require me to redefine those definitions for society as a whole.
Yes, people with those views, often they don't call themselves transgender and they call themselves transsexual instead. And I think maybe it's just a way of like reclaiming transsexual as a meaning. It means that they did something with their body, but that's all it means. It doesn't mean that they have a different gender identity or anything. So
that's a good distinction.
Yeah, they tend to, and I like that better. I like that transsexual refers to like the material reality of someone's body instead of transgender just means they have an identity. I don't know. On the same topic, I'm just thinking about, I've classified everyone who's gone through medical transition as post-transition, which is how I classify everyone who's been medicalized basically as part of the same political class. So that's one way in that.
And the contrast there would be desisters, who were people who had previously accepted the ideology, maybe identified as a different gender, but then later removed themselves from that way of thinking and that community without ever having taken surgical or medical steps.
Yeah.
So all of these different groups that we're talking about are people that would be considered those who had exited. And it seems like we mentioned this before, that if your position really is that gender identity is not fixed, it's fluid, and it can also be fluid over time, there should be no stigma to detransition. And that could and should be celebrated just as much as any other transition in somebody's life. But it's not. Why do you suppose that's the case?
I think that detransition implies something. It implies something about transition. And the reason that it's not celebrated by those same people is because even if they're not criticizing medical transition, there's still this aspect of the clinicians have failed. Something went wrong. This wasn't the proper path for them. And they might not even say that it wasn't the proper path for them. They might just say, oh yeah, I needed it as part of my journey. But at the end of the day, it's still a clinical failure. It's still, the treatment didn't do what it was supposed to do. And I think when the ideologues seeing that, they know underneath that it is a sign that something is going wrong. So it's not celebrated as much. It's pushed under the rug.
And that's where the blame reversal comes into play, so that the ideas itself, the dogma, can't be questioned.
Yeah.
Okay, so no honorable exit. What do you think?
Severe.
All right. There are a few things in this whole list that tend to be bigger red flags than other, and that no honorable exit is pretty powerful. Because you think of any other relationship or group in your life where if you decide you want to leave, people are like, oh, that's great. It's a non-issue. But when it becomes a big issue, it's a thing. That's where one of the things that we'll say in our own support groups is, if you want to assess whether or not a group is healthy or not, figure out how big the recovery group is from that church. So how big is the ex-Scientology recovery Reddit? And you can tell how traumatic something is, how difficult it is to leave, by how big the survivor community is.
That's interesting to think about. The Detrans Reddit is now 37,000 members. So,
and I've tried to follow that, but it seems like there's a troubled history with it, where because we're defining our societal norms of what constitutes hatred and bigotry according to the ideology itself, then all of that blame reversal, all of these things that we've been talking about get encoded into the rules of conduct for social media platforms themselves. So if people do want to come out and talk about this stuff, then they're labeled as hateful bigots by the social media platform and shut down. And that then is exploited by activists who want to get them shut down.
Yep. And we have that on, I'm one of the mods for the subreddit. So there is that sort of frequent, either people show up to try and say controversial things to try and get the subreddit banned. They'll post they'll just post things that are entirely inappropriate, just like porn or whatever, just to get the subreddit banned. People take things that we say out of context, and there are specific groups on Reddit, especially, that sort of monitor the groups that they think are hate groups, and they do think that Detrans is a hate group. And so they're just constantly talking about like how they're planning on taking us down and stuff like that. Yeah, no, I see how that's happened.
That plays a role into that whole no valid exit, because if you become a hateful bigot, if you leave, then, you know, certainly that's not valid. All right, the double bind. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The member is put in a catch-22 type situation. They are induced to either comply with the group and betray themselves, or dissent and be condemned by the group. You've talked about a few contradictions that in the community you have to grapple with.
I was fully convinced that trans is a thing that you are born. And this is another one of those language games where activists don't really say born in the wrong body anymore, but that is still literally what they mean. When they talk about trans, it's still, they were born in the wrong body. You have the wrong brain, quote unquote, or your brain is female or male, and then it's the rest of your body that's, I don't know, quote unquote, wrong. It is still a wrong body narrative, but they don't want you to say born in the wrong body anymore, because no body is wrong. But they'll say they'll say that no body is wrong, and that trans women can have penises, but also at the same time, Medicaid has to fund getting rid of those penises because some people don't want it. Like, it's a lot of contradictions, basically. That's another sort of contradiction that I experienced throughout transitioning, was that there was this, simultaneously I wanted to fit in and belong and be like everyone else, and at the exact same time knowing that if I was transitioning, I was always going to be different, and the reason I was transitioning is because I was already different and I had never fit in anywhere in my life. And then later on down the road, when I started dyeing my hair, I think that was another sort of thing where I was like, I'm different from everyone and I'm okay with that. And yeah, so it was a little bit of both.
It doesn't seem like there's any consistent right way to be. Which of these you feel made the most impact?
It's hard to say. There are really a lot of contradictions in gender ideology, like particularly the ones about a man can look like anything, or a female or a woman can look like anything. But even though they can look like anything, there's also like this impetus to move people towards medical transition because they need it, because it's life-saving. But if a man or a woman can look like whatever, then they shouldn't need to have to medicalize themselves and change their bodies.
I'm going to a trans surgeon for the first time next week for a consult. And I've had to, every day I've been asking myself, I'm like, okay, who are you doing? Are you doing this for yourself, or are you doing this for other people? And it's been for myself, but I have to even make sure that I'm not getting anything done that is because it is the standard of like what a woman is. And I even like, I hope that we can get to a place, my hope for the future is that we can get to a place where trans people don't feel like they have to change a thing about them to be trans, or they don't have to take the hormones if they don't want. They are a woman if they say they're a woman. They're a man if they say they're a man. Non-binary if they say they're non-binary. We believe people. We trust them. We lift them up. And yet I hope for that future, but we're not there yet. And so I have to make sure that I'm not just conforming to this binary.
Same.
And I even am scared. I'm like, oh, what if we do get to that place one day? And I'm scared about, or, you know, I do all these things now and then one day I might regret it. I don't want to live in that place because I want them now. And it feel like these are things that I've been sitting with for a long time. So I'm going to do them because it feels right. And we can't, as much as we can hope for the future, I can't look into 30 years from now and see who Dylan might be one day and like consider their opinion, because I have to live this life now in this body. So I want to serve it and I want to give it what it needs.
The one I brought up earlier was about like how other people react to seeing transphobia, for example. So there's those people who you're expected to both be the savior of the group, but also you're not supposed to be a savior of the group at the same time because they don't actually need you because it's infantilizing. So yeah.
From the outsider, I think when you look at documentaries like What is a Woman, it seems to be so filled with contradictions when he's talking with the affirmative care therapists and doctors.
I don't know if you've ever heard of people in the trans-abled community. These are people who are physically able-bodied but feel like they should be disabled or identify as such.
There are others who have a feeling that their genitals are not a proper part of their body integrity dysphoria.
For example, a man who has 2 arms but feels like he should have 1. If a man in this kind of marginalized community went to the doctor and said, I want to have my arm cut off, do you think that
doesn't have anything to do with gender identity?
This is in the SOC-8. It's also in ICD-11. It's classification 621 or 6C21. So it's there in the ICD as well as the standards of care.
Well, it's someone's self-identity, how someone identifies.
That's someone who has and I'll accept it as a mental diagnosis, a psychiatric condition. I don't even pretend to know what aptomenophilia is all about, but somehow it's the idea that you're fascinated or charmed by having a limb or part of a limb missing. Okay, I would say that's, pardon my non-medical language, kooky.
They desire to be not male, to be emasculated, but don't want to be female either. They have a male to eunuch gender dysphoria, now part of the SOC-8.
You don't see any? You think this is totally irrelevant?
Yep. But I am the first trans feminine person to be elected president of WPATH in its 43-year history.
I don't know if you've seen that documentary, but it's those contradictions that from the outside make it harder for people to take this thing seriously, but it has such power in terms of social consequences and how it's being incorporated into HR departments and corporate policy and governance. So people tend to just go along and not want to point out these contradictions, because if you point them out, then you're going to be branded a hateful bigot. So it's tough because that's its own type of catch-22 where you want to say the truth, but the consequences are going to be so bad that you end up having to not tell the truth and either go along with a lie or silence your own voice just to be accepted by the group that you now know is all ready to pounce on you the moment you dissent. It's a precarious place to be in. All right, so how powerful or strong or present was the double bind in your experience?
Intense.
Okay.